Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the welcome to the Scrutiny Committee of Wednesday, the 9th of June 2021. We will take, first of all, apologies and substitutions, and then the roll call. Do we have any apologies or substitutions?
Yes, councillors. Morning. We have Councillor Chris Ahern instead of Harry Coates, and Councillor Bailey substituting for Councillor McDade.
Thank you very much. And can we just do a roll call, please?
I'm just going to do this again. Obviously, we have Councillor McCall, Councillor Parrott. You could confirm your attendance as I say your name. Councillor Parrott.
Present.
Councillor Barrett.
Present.
Councillor Ahern.
Present.
Councillor Illingworth.
Present.
Councillor Jarvis.
Here.
Councillor Massey.
Present.
Councillor Bailey.
Present.
Councillor Reid.
Present.
Councillor Robertson.
Present.
Councillor Sarwar.
Present.
Councillor Smith.
Present.
Councillor Stewart.
Present.
Sorry, Councillor Stewart, was that a yes?
Yep, present.
Thank you. That's everybody here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And do we have any declarations of interest on today's agenda? No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Then we'll move on to item 3 on the agenda, which is the minute of the Scrutiny Committee of the 12th of May 2021. Are there any corrections or amendments to that minute for accuracy? Can we agree the minute? Oh, Councillor Ahern, you have a question?
Yeah, it's not directly related to these minutes, so I'll let you agree the minutes first if you'd like.
Certainly, Chris, thank you. Do we agree the minutes?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much indeed. Chris, you have a question?
I do, yes. It's regarding outstanding actions from previous committees. Last year we had 2 outstanding scrutiny reviews, one on Abernite and one on the governance of the local action partnerships. We're still waiting for yourself to form a subgroup to look at the scope of a review for Abernite, and I just wondered when that was going to take part because it hasn't been mentioned in the last 2 meetings.
You're quite correct, Chris. It hasn't been mentioned in the last 2 meetings. I did answer a question on this at the last meeting. Because many of our officers were redeployed elsewhere and we weren't working in normal democratic processes, then these scrutiny reviews have not progressed as quickly as I personally would have liked. However, they are still on the radar and they will be, now we're coming back into normal democratic cycle of process and meetings, and officers are coming back from the redeployment on the COVID response. Then I expect this to move forward quite expeditiously and fairly soon. I should also perhaps just take this opportunity as well to thank the officers generally who support this committee and who have done such a sterling job with the COVID response. I know it can't have been easy, and I also understand why some things had to be delayed and set aside for the time being. But I hope that answers your question, Councillor Ahern.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Stewart, you have a comment to make?
Yes, thank you, Convener. It was just to add an issue that is also outstanding from, I would be pushed if I could remember exactly, but at least a couple of years ago, we were promised a full report on the top slicing of the Business Gateway budget.
Okay.
Dundee City Council, and also a performance report on Business Gateway. And I just wondered when these would be added to, coming forward and added to the agenda. As I say, that's not a recent sort of delayed by COVID issue. That is a couple of years ago now.
It is indeed, Councillor Stewart, and I do recall those items coming up at scrutiny, and I will follow up on those as well. I think as we start bringing, like I said earlier to Councillor Ahern, as we start getting back into normal processes, which I hope will be sustainable, and we won't go back into a situation where we're relying on a shorter committee timetable, that we'll pick up on all of those. But point well made. Thank you, Councillor Stewart. It was before my time as convener, but I will pick that up and take it forward.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions on the minute or actions outstanding? Councillor Barrett, you have a question.
My question is about the process as well, related to Councillor Hearn's, I think. If we could have an explanation about why the invitation to this meeting wasn't sent out until Monday afternoon. We didn't get paper 5 until 4:30 on Monday afternoon, and that doesn't really give elected members time to scrutinise properly. And I just wonder if we could please be advised what steps can be taken to improve the process.
Thank you, Councillor Barrett, for your question. I have already intimated to council officers that I did intend to make comment today on the lateness of the papers, in particular, the one that was issued on Monday afternoon, because it's quite a substantive paper. And while I accept that officers have done a sterling job on their COVID redeployment, I don't think it's acceptable for this committee, either for members of the public or indeed for members of the press, to have in such a short period of time to scrutinise the papers ahead of this committee. And perhaps Lisa or some different committee services would like to make comment on that. Lisa Simpson, are you here?
Yes, I am here, Councillor.
Thanks, Lisa.
In terms of the invite, I'm not sure why that came out on Monday. We can definitely remedy that. That is not a problem. The timetable is fixed, so we know when the meetings are, so that will not be an issue. As regards the particular paper, I understand that the officer, the head of innovation, will be addressing that particular point herself when she opens, when she introduces the report. However, my understanding of the situation is that the LGBF report is based on data produced by them, and they changed the data and reissued fresh data within the last week or so. So all of the stats had to be rerun. So Monday was the first point when we were able to actually get the finalised report. We took a decision as to whether or not to pull the report, but that would mean that it wouldn't now come back to you until after recess. And given that the information that is reported is of some vintage, is the 1920 stats, we thought that it was better to put it up late and let you see it now for whatever relevance that may have given the vintage of the report, but it was genuinely circumstances beyond the control of the officers involved in drafting the report. So apologies for that. We will endeavour to make sure that reports are issued timeously. We appreciate it was a big report. We appreciate that Monday is not sufficient time for you to have a look at that. But as I said, I would caution it is data of some vintage, and the choice was between putting it to you today, late, or withholding it again and adding another several months to the relevance of the data that you'll actually be looking at today.
Lisa, when does this report need to be submitted?
It doesn't need to be. We're actually at the mercy of when the LGBF and the Improvement Service issue the data. So it's gathered from all different points. We respond to it as soon as we get it. But it's always one of those ones where it's a very long and cumbersome process to actually pull that report together. And as I said, we didn't expect the data to be refreshed, particularly not as we'd already done the majority of the drafting of the report and it was pretty much good to go, but it actually had to be completely rerun. But I'm sure Charlene will be able to speak in greater detail to that when she actually introduces the report herself. But all I can say on behalf of committee services and officers is we did our very best, but you do have our sincere apologies for that. Okay,
Lisa, I mean, I've written to you separately before this meeting to say that I've had a number of people raise the validity of being able to scrutinise this report at this meeting today. And if there's no deadline on submission, I would like to take the mood of the committee members to see whether or not they feel they've had sufficient time to scrutinise this report sufficiently. It is a hefty report and it is important, and whether or not we should pull it today altogether. So I'm minded to go ahead with it at this time, and I do understand your explanation, but it's not the only paper that was late this time, and there has been, not just at this committee, but to others, papers, you know, coming forward late, and it's not acceptable in my view at all. It reduces and diminishes the democratic process. And so now that officers are returning from the sterling work they've done in their COVID redeployment, I would sincerely hope that across all of the committees in the council that we will not see this number of late papers being produced. I don't know why the invitations weren't issued in advance, Councillor Barrett, or why the invitation didn't come out in advance, but Committee services will look into that, but that again, that's not acceptable. I suspect because the papers weren't ready, the invitations weren't issued. But can I get a sense of the room, please, as to whether or not you wish this paper to proceed today? Councillor Parrott, you have a comment to make.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Given all that's been said, and given that the paper is ultimately for noting, can I suggest that we formally deal with the paper today, but allow any questions that arise from people's scrutiny of it to come forward at the next meeting? I see no sense in formally delaying consideration of it, given its vintage. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parrott. That is my view. Otherwise, I would have suggested taking it off the table altogether. But I did want. But a number of people have approached me about the lateness, not just Councillor Barrett mentioning it today. Councillor Barrett, do you have a comment to make?
I'd just like to say that I agree with everything you said, Convener, about the lateness of the papers, both for this meeting and other council meetings, and it would be very much appreciated if this is dealt with. I also agree with your suggestion that we go ahead with the paper, not least because I got up at 5:30 this morning to be able to read it before the meeting. So thank you.
Yes, I had a late night on Monday reading it myself. So thank you. So if there's no objections, then we'll proceed as per the agenda today, and we'll see how this evolves. But I think it's something worth noting, and I shall work offline with committee services and to make sure that this doesn't happen again, not just for this, but for other committee meetings as well. So thank you everyone for your patience and for your input to this discussion. Okay, so now we move on to item 4 of the agenda, which is the annual governance statement, and that has been introduced. Lisa, you're introducing that one, I think?
I am indeed, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Before you is the draft annual governance statement for the council, which is attached to the final accounts, which will be considered by the audit committee on the 30th of June. In terms of this is a process that we have to go and give assurance that we have an appropriate and adequate system of internal controls. We have gone through the process. You will appreciate, as has been alluded to several times already this morning, the year 2021 has been quite an exceptional and unprecedented year in terms of the challenges that it has posed for the council operating as a council, and the council also operating as a Category 1 response in the middle of a global health crisis. To give you some assurance, the process that was followed, we've always followed a very robust process in terms of assessing our processes of internal control. This year, because of the way we are all operating, the usual mechanism for doing that was changed slightly, but we worked very closely with our external auditors who, on the basis of very consistent, robust assessments of our control system, were satisfied to take last year's process as a baseline, and we're simply looking at how our processes were able to be adapted and modified, and new processes that were introduced to ensure that we maintained that system of control during this year as we dealt with exceptional operational challenges and new operational challenges. The process has gone through. We have received certificates of assurance from the key governance officers, so that includes myself as the monitoring officer, the Section 95 officer as the head of finance, procurement officer, data protection officer, HR manager and OD manager. Each service has also gone through and checked how internal controls have worked within their own sphere of operations, and they have provided assurance. In terms of our subsidiary groups, we have sought assurance from our arm's length organisations, and Tayside Valuation Joint Board, Tayside Contracts and the IJB are all obliged to produce their own annual governance statements to satisfy themselves as regards their system of internal control, and we have sought assurance from their own assurance process. I'm pleased to report that the system of internal control has proved to be adequate and robust. It has adapted very well to the challenges over the last year. There are no key concerns that were either not areas that we were always marked for improvement or further development. One point I would draw your attention to is the fact that the improvement actions from last year clearly have not had the opportunity to be worked upon in terms of revision of policy processes, etc. But these have not been substantive so as to render our process of internal control inadequate or lacking in any way. These improvement actions are wrapped up into our service improvement plans, and any actions that have been identified from this report will also be dealt with in that way. From my point of view, I am assuring the Scrutiny Committee that we have had in place adequate internal controls to manage the risk that has arisen in terms of our vast operations and our new and novel operations over this past year. But I'm happy to take any questions, and there are other officers available to address any particular points. If there are any detailed points that people would like further information on that I don't have to hand, I'd be happy to take that offline and then circulate to all members in due course.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a reminder, if there are any questions at this point, please put Q in the chat box and I shall call you to ask your question. And first we have Councillor Alistair Bailey. You have a question, Alistair?
Thank you, Convener. My question's about cybersecurity, and that gets a couple of mentions within the report. Things like the recent appalling cyber attack on SEPA, and then there's reports of potential cyber attacks having compromised some schools in neighbour local authorities in recent weeks, have really focused the mind on those risks that are now maybe as high as other physical security was in our cash offices potentially only a couple of years ago. In light of that, what changes are happening or are in process? And obviously I don't expect you to give anything away that would be of assistance to a potential attacker. Thank you.
No. Can I just say that that has been recognised as a corporate risk, not just for this authority, but I think for all authorities and public bodies across the way. In terms of cyber security, most attacks actually happen because people click on links that they shouldn't click on. So we clearly are going to be pushing training and awareness around phishing, etc. But we also have another aspect to look at, that as we operate in this environment, we also need to think about not cyber resilience as well as cyber security attacks, cyber security resilience in terms of accessibility and availability. That has been recognised. We are working on that at a corporate and service team level. It will be reflected in the corporate risk register, which will be presented to the audit committee hopefully on the 30th of June. But that's very much on our radar, Councillor, and very much an area that the whole organisation is focused on addressing.
Thank you for that reassurance. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Liz Barrett. Liz, you have a question?
Thank you, Convener. Sorry?
No, carry on.
Yeah, and thank you to the Head of Legal and Governance Services for the report and for your reassurance that the improvements will be included in service improvement plans, because that was another question that I had. How are you going to tackle the backlog and everything in Section 10? I just wanted to flag that I know this annual governance statement is to be published with the Council's final accounts. In reading it, I spotted some typos and grammatical errors, but particularly in the statement by the Acting Chief Executive and Leader of the Council on page 21, it just trails off into nothing in the last paragraph. This may be something to tackle and circulate to members of the committee separately, but as we move from emergency response measures to supporting our communities to recover from the impact of COVID-19, our governance framework will continue to be reviewed and adapted where necessary to ensure Yes, it's to ensure that our system of internal control and governance framework remains robust and appropriate. And we do love KPMG, but I don't think they're our eternal auditors. Do you know what? I think perhaps that's the one that's missed the last sense check, because we've already changed eternal auditors. So absolute apologies for that. This is also the joys, can I just say, I'm not making an excuse, apologies for that. This will all be remedied before it goes on the 30th. But because we have autosave, we've been working on the basis of the autosave and then discovered that there's a little gremlin that didn't autosave if we didn't open it up in a desktop. So that will be entirely my word blindness and failure to recognise the autosave. And so mea culpa, I will have that fixed, Councillor Barrett. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Barrett and Lisa, and thank you for that response, Lisa. I'm sure there are elected members everywhere who sympathise with your word blindness and challenges with technology. Are there any other? Thank you. Are there any other questions on this report? No. Then can I ask that we note the report?
I agree.
Noted.
Thank you very much.
Noted.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to the next report, the annual governance statement. And my apologies, the local government benchmarking framework, and I'll call on Charlene Gill to introduce that report, please. Charlene, are you here?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Councillor McCall. I'm very pleased to present. Thank you, Councillor McCall. Good morning. I'm very pleased to present our local government benchmarking framework report today, and I'll start with an apology because of its late submission. The report presents a summary of Perth Kinross Council's performance during 2019-20 against the local government benchmarking framework indicators published by the Improvement Service. The data for 2019-20 was initially published in February 2021. However, this was refreshed on the 24th of May 2021, which resulted in last-minute changes to the data, requiring a refresh of the data itself, rankings, and the accompanying text. These changes have included, and there are now a full suite of indicators, including all the Children's Services performance indicators and the costs data, which is based on the audited accounts by the Scottish Government. In the past, this has not been the case, as we would normally report earlier in the year. The data itself is displayed on the Improvement Service Toolkit, which is on their website, and additionally, this is embedded on our own PKC website in terms of performance and benchmarking pages. There is a link within the report. The benchmarking data helps the Council, members of the public and other stakeholders understand how we are performing in key areas compared to other local authorities in Scotland. It's also intended as an internal performance tool which supports decision making, helps us to better understand factors that we can control and improve, and will be used to inform the development of the Council's wider performance management and planning framework. Within the report, we must take into account the variations in data that will exist across councils due to local policy choices and demographic profiles. For example, rural local authorities such as ourselves will have different calls upon their environment service functions compared to urban authorities, and these are reflected within the statistics. Rankings between councils can also show variations as small as 1 to 2% of a difference, which can be sometimes misleading in terms of ranking, achievement and performance. For cost indicators, ranking is also not as useful, as reduced costs do not necessarily mean improved outcomes for local communities and people, and as a result, the cost indicators have not been ranked. There are 19 cost performance indicators, and it is almost a 50-50 split in terms of cost increasing or decreasing over the 12 months from 2018-19 to 2019-20. This is broadly similar with previous years. We have 54 performance indicators which exclude attainment, where we have not made comparison with previous years as that information was not available. Of the 54 performance indicators, 19 indicators have improved performance over the past year, with 35 indicators decreasing performance. However, it's worth noting that this trend has been seen nationally, and we are still above the Scottish average in 32 of the performance indicators. For example, we still rank in the upper quartiles for all satisfaction measures, although the national picture has been decreasing now for some years, and in line with this, our rates have also decreased. 31 performance indicators are sitting in the top 2 quartiles, with the remaining 30% in the lower middle quartile and only 13% in the lower quartile. Details of performance indicators in the top and bottom quartiles can be found on page 9 of the Local Government Benchmarking Framework report. The 2021 data collection process will commence shortly, and during the course of the rest of the year, the Improvement Service have a programme of virtual workshops, events and different service areas to try and understand the impact of COVID on the local government benchmarking framework information and the suite of performance indicators. In addition to the data, the report has a new look this year. The communication and performance team have been working hard to ensure that the information is in plain English, with less business narrative and summarised information around the key indicators. Statistical information has been presented as infographics to simplify the data, along with colour coding for those who interpret information in this way. This ensures a clear understanding and accuracy of reporting, which is accessible to a range of different audiences, taking complex information and making this easier to understand. I'd like to thank you for your patience in waiting for this report and once again apologise for the late submission. I would now welcome any comments and questions, bearing in mind the lateness of the submission.
Thank you, Charlene. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Oh, I do now. I do have one question on a comment you made there about the impact of COVID. And given that this is a report for 1920 data, and COVID hadn't really begun to impact us, I'm just wondering what the relevance is to the report before us today.
I think I was referring to the work that the Improvement Service are just about to begin on the 2021 LGBF report, and they are holding events, conferences and a series of consultations asking various councils about the impact of COVID and how that will impact on our data next year. Okay,
thank you, Charlene. I thank for that clarification. Yes, so Councillor Illingworth, you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you for the report. Do you have any concrete examples of how using the framework has led to improvements in how we deliver services in PKC?
Thank you for your question. I'm just going to pass over to Louisa or Claire Miller. I'm just wondering if Claire would be able to answer this.
Yes, thank you, Charlene, and thank you, Councillor Illingworth, for your question. Benchmarking is obviously with other local authorities is a key activity that we undertake across all areas, and we probably across the council have a number of good examples whereby we have used the local government benchmarking framework to identify improvement and indeed introduce improved practice. One example of this within the housing service is some work that we undertook in relation to rent arrears. The data that we looked at, you'll probably see we have had improvement within our rent arrears more recently, was to look to other local authorities to really understand some of their good working practice arrangements. Our very successful tenancy sustainment fund, which members certainly of the Housing and Communities Committee will be aware of, is one such area of good practice that we have introduced here in Perth and Kinross to support our approach to rent arrears, and that has resulted in improved performance and outcomes.
Thank you, Claire. Does that answer your question, Councillor Illingworth?
Yep, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Councillor Alistair Bailey, please, you have a question.
Thank you, Convener. My question is about some of the figures on page 21 of the report. That's the overall document pack. For clarity, it's CHN 6 and CHN 7. Just to start with, I'm shocked and surprised at the level, at the size of the attainment gap that we have in Perth and Kinross, according to these figures, between people from deprived areas and how they're doing in their hires, compared to how people from less deprived areas are doing. In one example there, for the level 5, the people in more deprived areas are 1/3 behind, and actually for the level 6s, they are only performing at 50% the level compared to the national benchmark. So my question is actually twofold. First of all, did we expect the figures to come out at this level? Did we have any inkling that we were going to benchmark at these levels compared to our peers? And then secondly, what's being done to address this in hopefully the current academic year and future academic years? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bailey. Who wants to answer that question?
I'll take that question, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's Sharon Johnson, and good morning,
Sharon.
everyone. Could I just perhaps give a little bit of context to the attainment figures that are in this report? In terms of education performance, due to the assessment approaches, these arrangements these measures are not comparable in previous years. PKC attainment is generally good and steadily improving in line with Scotland. However, as can be seen from the latest attainment reporting, challenges do still remain, especially in narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap. The Audit Scotland report, which was recently published in March, recognised that the SIMD measures which are used for these benchmarking reports are not useful for less urban authorities, and that includes Perth Kinross. And that's why members will be aware that when we look at our own arrangements, we look at ACORN data, because that gives a better reflection of attainment in deprived areas. So we're well aware of the differences between the comparators. In terms of the measures, Councillor Bailey, that you've talked about there, this is about measuring the percentage of only the S6 cohort of pupils gaining level 5 and level 6 awards overall. That's different from the way that we would normally benchmark those in education, where we look at all leavers in a particular year, regardless of when they leave school. But you're absolutely right. Where PKC attainment is generally in line with the Scottish average, so although we've been improving, so indeed has the rest of the country. Where our gap exists, it's within those areas of most deprivation. So for instance, if we looked at the measure which measures 5 awards at level 5 in the most deprived areas, we would require an additional 10 pupils to achieve to get to the national average. And as Charlene mentioned in her introduction, those rankings are sometimes slightly misleading, because it looks like there are large numbers of our young people who are not achieving as well as the Scottish average. So for instance, if we looked at 5 at level 6, which would be 5 hires in S6 leavers, then we would need in Perth Kinross an additional 7 young people to achieve to reach the national average. In terms of how did we know that this was coming, I think we've raised in many reports over recent years that the stubborn areas for us to improve in Perth Kinross is absolutely those cohorts who are in the most deprived areas. We do have a raising attainment strategy which seeks to address that, and every year in November we put together an overall performance against all of our attainment measures for PKC. We do have a significant amount of improvements in relation to how we intend to deal with this. What we recognise is that we need to pay very close attention to our inclusive practice within schools, and we also know that there are a number of schools where this is much more of an issue than in others. I would like to ask David McCluskey, our Service Manager for Secondary Schools, to perhaps take us through some of the improvement actions, if that would be acceptable, Councillor McCall.
Yes, that's perfectly acceptable, thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Councillor. So some of the improvement actions that we do plan round about these particular measures for the next academic session, we've revised the quality improvement framework to create more focused actions around attainment, and particularly those attainment gaps, some of which we're discussing today. We've given clear direction to our head teachers regarding the particular link between deprivation and attainment, and we'll continue to do that. We'll have focused and directed work by our attainment advisor plan for the next session with our schools to create our own models for further improvement based in Perth Kinross. We're also conducting a full review in session 21-22 of our senior phase curricular offer to maximise attainment. And this is linked to other work that we're doing in virtual learning, the virtual campus, and widening subject choice in secondary schools funded through budget motion money. We're doing focused work for secondary schools next session and improving attendance through the lens of ACORN 4 and 5. We're funding pupil care and welfare officers for all our secondary schools through Scottish Government COVID funding to help improve that measure. We're also funding from this source to create capacity to ensure that all leavers gain literacy and numeracy qualifications at the highest possible level, so that nobody will slip through any gap for those measures. We're also sharing strategies with those schools who have more successfully improved the attainment in SIMD Quintile 1 with other schools, and that's an ongoing piece of work. And we're got more focused and clear direction in general from our Raising Attainment Board on these issues, so more concrete actions of the likes I've outlined above for the session to come. We're also conducting a strategic review of learner pathways in conjunction with colleagues at Perth College UHI and Skills Development Scotland, again to ensure that motivation and learning continues and that learners have clear pathways within and beyond their own schools at Perth Kinross. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Bailey, you have a supplementary question. Do you want to?
Yeah.
If it's not been answered.
Like we might be victims of small sample sizes. It might be useful to print the sample sizes onto these in future, or maybe make them available as an appendix. But my further question was just, I wonder if our own analysis by Acorn profiles could maybe be circulated, and if we have that data for any neighbouring or comparator local authorities, if that might be circulated as well, obviously as an after meeting follow up. Thank you. Thank you,
Councillor Bailey. Do David or Sharon want to comment on that?
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Bailey. We do indeed have that data, and we do analyse our performance and present it. So we have a full raising attainment report which was presented to Lifelong Learning Committee in November, and as we speak we are collating our data and reporting from this year, so we'd be happy to share that with members.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Councillor Bailey. Councillor Crawford-Reid, please, you have a question?
Thank you, Convener. My question relates to the discharge criteria for people from hospital. Can I ask who assesses the discharge criteria, who collates the data, and if we have any information on readmission rates within, say, 2 weeks of discharge?
Councillor McCall, can I answer that, please?
You can indeed, yes. My apologies, Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Reid. The determination around whether or not someone's clinically fit for discharge is a multidisciplinary decision that would be taken on the hospital wards with the involvement of the nursing staff, the respective consultant, and critically the social work team, who would be often putting in place arrangements for people to be supported to return home. So that's certainly a multidisciplinary decision. The point when someone is medically fit for discharge, their details are recorded on a system, and from that day onwards, a calculation is determined on the length of delay. There is a process that distinguishes the reason for delay, and we put in details whether someone is waiting for a housing solution, a specialist resource, a care at home package, or OT aids and adaptations. So the NHS systems record all that information, and I would anticipate that it's from those systems that the improvement service will draw down the data in order to identify the lengths of delay that people are experiencing across Scotland. What I would say in relation to SW8, the particular indicator around delayed discharge, the figure there reflects the number of people delayed in hospital per 100,000 of the population once they are medically fit for discharge. And at the same time, as we in Perth and Kinross have obviously seen a steady growth in the older population. In the past 5 years, the Health and Social Care Partnership have contributed to a reduction in that figure from 15,408 bed days lost 5 years ago to 8,369 bed days lost in the year covered by this report. So material improvements, but absolutely no complacency at all, as we recognise the importance of supporting people to be discharged from hospital as early as possible. It's not where people need to be once they're medically fit, and whilst they're there, they're obviously preventing other people from receiving the services that could otherwise be an offer. I hope that that's covered most of your question, Councillor Reid. I'm happy to be picked up if there's anything that I've missed there.
Councillor Reid, does that answer your question?
Yeah, very comprehensive, Gordon. Thanks very much. I suppose the other aspect was, do we know a readmission rate?
Yeah, so
obviously everything's significantly changed.
Yes, absolutely. So just to be clear, though, that the period covered by this report precedes the COVID episode, but I was interested to see from the Improvement Services metadata that they have calculated some of these figures based on the first and second quarter of the year, multiplied by 51 weeks, and the fourth quarter added on another week to reflect the fact that early in that calendar year we were beginning to see the impacts of COVID. However, in terms of readmission rates, SW6 shows the rate of readmission to hospital within 28 days per 100,000. I have to say that this is a statutory indicator that is included in the Health and Social Care Partnership's annual performance report and is regularly reported to the IJB's Audit and Performance Committee. However, with colleagues in Tayside, we've identified a recording anomaly in Tayside which conflates inpatient and outpatient readmissions and skews the figures. So having identified that as an issue, we're looking to remedy it. And this will result in more accurate data, which will show lower readmission rates being reported and recorded. So there is an issue that we need to address in the context of how the data locally is recorded. We've identified that and we're now working with colleagues to seek to address it. We would obviously be very keen to ensure that a reduction in readmission rates was one of our objectives, because to not have that gives some sort of indication that you know, there could be a risk that people are being discharged too soon when they're maybe not fit to go home. So we're absolutely on top of that and looking to try to resolve the recording issues that I've alluded to.
Thank you, Gordon. Crawford, does that answer your questions now?
It does. My SW6 has been cut off in its prime.
Yes, yes. The printed copies of the reports don't show the full spread of them. That's another issue with late papers, I suppose. Thank you, Crawford, and thank you, Gordon Patterson, for your response. Thank you very much. Next, we have Councillor Chris Ahern. You have a question, Chris?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, my question's on indicator CHN 17 on page 23 of the report, and it's the drop in 4% of the number of children meeting the developmental milestones. Can I ask, what sort of numbers are we talking about, and can we have an explanation as to why there's such a big drop? Because we've dropped 12 places in the rankings, but we've also more significantly dropped below the Scottish average.
Yeah,
Who wants to take that?
That would be myself, Councillor McCall. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
So thank you, Councillor Ahern. This indicator is about the 27 to 30 months developmental milestones for children, which is conducted by health visitors. And so therefore the data that we get is about the milestones that young children meet in relation to a set of indicators that have been agreed by health. Again, I would have to say that there is caution required in relation to these figures, because the full results have not been available to us, and therefore there are some unidentified concerns in here. So due to lockdown periods, health visitors were unable to complete all checks and assessments, and we feel that that has probably skewed our figures slightly, because in general, Perth Kinross developmental milestones figures are always above the average. What we have been able to indicate is that where we're considering the children where full results have been available, PKC does indeed go above the Scottish average of 77%, and PKC are sitting at 78%. However, we do still have some children who do not meet their developmental milestones. The reasons for that are, in general, our emerging picture, which has always been the case. Those children in more deprived areas fail to meet their developmental milestones rather than children who are in more affluent areas. The main causes of those developmental milestones not being met are by far the biggest risk factors are social and communication and language and communication issues, and social, emotional and behavioural needs. We also recognise that boys suffer far more in terms of delay of their developmental milestones than girls do. And we've known this for quite some time, and we've been making good progress and actually seeing some improvements in some of those measures over recent years. So the things that we're looking to do is we're looking to make sure that we get the information from our health visitor colleagues at an earlier stage so that we can intervene earlier. And we have a range of language and communication programmes that are happening in our nurseries. And in fact, we are due to fund additional speech and language therapy to come and work in our nurseries with our staff to upskill them in how they can build a sustainable model of language development. We've also increased, due to the expansion monies, additional staff within early years settings, and we've recently employed 20 family support workers who will be supporting families to engage in their children's learning, which we know is a really important, effective way to increase the attainment, and particularly in areas of higher deprivation within our local authorities. So we're also looking at the moderation of assessments, because as you know, across 80 settings, different staff may have different thresholds about whether someone has met their thresholds. That hasn't been very well moderated in the past, and so this year we're concentrating very much on making sure that there are moderated sessions and discussions amongst staff about sharing thresholds across the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Chris, does that answer your question, or do you have a supplementary?
Thank you very much. Yes, it does answer the question, but percentages are all very well, but having actual figures gives a better indication of the issue. 4% might be a fairly small number, but equally 4% might be quite a large number. So I think it would be useful to have actual figures as to let us know what we're actually looking at.
Okay. I will endeavour to get that to you, Councillor Ahern. We don't have those figures, but perhaps we could get them.
Thank you, Sharon. I think if anything's going to be issued as a supplementary to a question, it should be shared to everybody in the committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chris. Councillor Liz Barrett, you have a question?
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to thank the Interim Chief Executive and the officers for this report, and I especially welcome the improvement actions being taken to tackle the deprivation-related indicators for children and young people. I'm looking at indicators. I've lost the numbers, but looking at the roads indicators, I note that we've had a 24% reduction in the roads revenue since 2010-11 because of national policies. But at the budget meeting earlier this year, we set aside an additional 4 million into the budget to tackle roads improvements and safety. And I just wondered how we were getting on with applying that and when we could expect to see the impact of that coming through on the benchmarking stats.
Who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll take that if that's okay, please.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Barrett, you're absolutely right. This year at the budget session meeting, the council did agree an extra £4 million investment into roads. So hopefully we will see some improvement. You know, the figures in the report, as you indicated, reflect effectively underinvestment over a number of years, but the council's recognised the need for that investment and has put that extra £4 million in. So hopefully we will see some level of improvements over the next 12 months, and that will filter through into maybe the 21-22 figures. Although it will not be significant improvement because there is quite a backlog, and it will take us some time to get up to the Scottish average, and will require sustained investment as well. That's one-off investment at the moment, so we will need to see that year-on-year investment to see that indicator increase year-on-year.
Thank you, Mark. Liz, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Councillor Fiona Sarver, you have a question?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, my question is on the climate indicators, which is on page 26 of the appendix. We actually rank quite low on the climate indicators 1 and 2, 24 out of 32, and rank 27 out of 32 for our carbon emissions area wide, and then within the scope of the LA. So just wondered if somebody can comment on what is being done to accelerate the rate of reduction. Obviously we want to reach zero emissions, and I just wondered if somebody could speak to our climate crisis actions. Thank you. Thank you,
Councillor Sarver. Mark, will you be taking that one, or is there someone else here from Environment Services?
I can try, Councillor McCall. Yes, as you pointed out, Councillor Sarver, you know, climate change is a major issue for all local authorities up and down the country, and even globally. I do know that the council is putting together climate change action plans, and there's something which cut through right across all services So I think we will be bringing some members in the near future about the actions we will take, but it is absolutely at the top of the council's agenda in terms of priorities and putting together a plan. In terms of more detail, I'd have to bring that to you separately or ask colleagues to do that, but it is absolutely top of the priority list, so I can reassure you of that.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Sarwar, does that answer your question?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't. And I think that's fine. I understand. And obviously, we've had this report late as well. And perhaps I'm not able to ask a more specific question. But I think it's interesting to note that we don't have somebody here today to be able to answer specifically on that. And yesterday I was part of an IS webinar on the green recovery, which is across a lot of councils. And a lot of different council areas did speak about how they had specific officers that were working on their climate crisis actions. And I know we've been waiting this plan, and I understand that with the COVID actions, we've not been able to perhaps progress that at the rate we need to, but unfortunately the climate crisis is not slowing down, and I do think it would be really it would have been really good if we'd had somebody here today that could have spoken specifically on this issue. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Sarwar. I have to say I do agree with you. It is disappointing that we don't have somebody specifically to address these issues, and I had myself picked up some of these indicators. Back in August last year, in fact, when we had the awful floods throughout Perth and Kinross, and particularly in Perth City, I did write to the then Chief Executive requesting that the Climate Action Plan be updated and presented to councillors, but I have yet to see it. And perhaps it's something I'll take a sounding from members of this committee after this meeting to see whether or not it's something we'd like to see brought forward here to scrutiny, because I think it's somewhere on the back burner and it's quite an important issue. So thank you, Councillor Sarwar. Then we have Councillor Stewart, you have a question? Oh, sorry, Claire Miller, do you have a comment to make on this subject?
Yes, I think just to add to, I think the response, and I think to first of all add to Mark's response in terms of our focused approach. What I would first of all say that this is a new addition to the local government benchmarking framework, this new indicator, or these new indicators. As Mark has said, to reduce our emissions per resident, we're currently finalising our climate action plan. There are 5 main areas or main emission sectors that we're really focusing on in terms of building, transport, waste, business and industry and land use. The plan very much will focus on how we can lead by example in reducing emissions, as well as how we can obviously implement the enabling factors to facilitate, support and empower businesses and indeed residents to take action. There is a climate change elected member briefing on tomorrow afternoon, and discussions, more detailed discussions, will take place at that briefing. Peter Marshall and the wider team will be available. We have got an environment work stream and a climate change action plan with a significant number of senior officers and indeed more widely across the Perth and Kinross area supporting the overall climate change action plan. So elected members will have an opportunity tomorrow to hear much more detail in terms of the plans that we're taking forward and indeed the bringing forward the climate change action plan to council. So there'll be an opportunity for discussion, questions and input to that. I understand it's on tomorrow afternoon.
It is.
Yeah.
I think there's some confusion in the chat here about what date tomorrow is, but it is the 10th of June, and I think that is when the meeting is. Am I correct?
Yes, I understand. Yeah. It's on tomorrow.
Thank you, Claire, for your reply. Unfortunately, because this briefing is on a Thursday, and very often these briefings are not necessarily with a lot of notice, not all elected members will be able to attend. So perhaps it might be worthwhile considering running that particular briefing again. Just because yes, I don't think all elected members will be able to attend, and it's quite an important one. So perhaps we can find some time in the diary, perhaps on a Monday or a Wednesday, where elected members who can't attend tomorrow can attend this briefing. Thank you.
I would agree with that, and I think again it's understandable. I mean, obviously we've not got all elected members here at today's committee, and likewise not all officers available, so that will provide an opportunity, and if further opportunities are required, then absolutely, of course, we will organise that.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Councillor Sarwar, for your questions. Councillor Stewart.
Thanks, convener. And as to a question on readmission from Councillor Reid, the Chief Officer Director of Integrated Health and Social Care said that a data recording anomaly potentially meant that outpatients were being confused with inpatients for the readmission rate, which leads me on to a wider question, which is how certain are we that the data we record and provide for the local government benchmarking framework is being collected in a consistent manner and within the same parameters as the other local authorities? Could there be a series of other indicators where there are data recording anomalies?
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Gordon Patterson, would you like to respond to that question, please?
Well, I think it's probably given that Mr. Patterson's answered in respect of his, then I think it's probably a wider question for everybody. But if Gordon,
well, in that case, Charlene, who introduced the report, could you perhaps respond to that question?
Yes, thank you, Councillor McCall. So we have metadata that's set out for all councils, and the metadata itself comes from the improvement service. So any other data or indicators that perhaps gave an alternative or more detailed information would have to come from a different report, Councillor Stewart. I noticed that Gordon's just here and could perhaps comment further for the Health and Social Care Partnership. I know that their APR will give a different context to some similar information.
Thank you, Charlene. Gordon, you have a comment?
Thank you. I mean, Councillor Stewart, I can't obviously respond to the broader query about the extent to which we can have confidence in the reliability and the validity of apples versus pears. I mean, my point was going to be to illustrate that we have seen a sharp decline, concerningly and perhaps surprisingly, in one of our indicators, and this relates to SW3A. This indicator reflects the balance between the number of people resident in care homes and the number of people receiving personal care at home. Now, the decline in our relative position is because we have cleansed the data. We've looked at the data and we've recognised the need to be very clear that we were only reporting older people, to which this indicator pertains, and we are only including personal care. So where we provide domestic support and telecare and social care and other types of care and support, we've stripped that out. That has had the effect of taking us declining our relative position. Now that is a concern. We're looking at that. We're looking at the balance of care because we've got a strategic ambition to continue to try to support as many people at home as possible for as long as possible, safely and independently. The other variable here is for us to stand still is a mark of good performance if the demographics are, if the numbers of older people are significantly increasing. But what we don't know in terms of that data cleansing exercise is how other councils are calculating their data and the veracity of their data, because as we know, the benchmarking data is only of value if we are able to be confident that we're comparing apples with apples. So notwithstanding the fact that we have moved in the benchmark, I am much more concerned about how effectively we are performing against the standards we would set ourselves. And I think it's also really important that we don't discredit only that data that reflects poorly on our performance. We can't cherry pick that. So I'm very confident in relation to our delayed discharge figures, but that's not because it says so in the benchmarking data that the improvement service are providing. That's because we are looking in detail at what it means in practice for our ambition to promote that strategic objective and in terms of people's experiences of our services. So there's a lot in there, but it's very challenging in the context of the various sources of data that come together, the various calculations that are then applied, and the outputs that produces can introduce at various stages of that process some confidence factors that maybe do diminish the value of looking specifically at how we compare to others.
I think you've captured in a nutshell, Gordon, the question that I was asking. So for the example of the indicator that you've just given, SW3A, a data cleansing exercise has significantly shifted our position, and you know, and I'm sure that you and the other health and social care partnership officers are just as you've said, looking to make sure that people are fully supported with an ageing demographic. But my question, going back to what Claire said, was if and the point that you encapsulated was, if we have done a data cleansing exercise on that indicator and that has significantly shifted our position, how do we know whether the other local authorities have already done the data cleansing exercise or are yet to do it, and therefore shift their relative position, not just in relation to SW3A or SW6 or 7, the one that Councillor Reid was referring to, but in relation to the totality of those indicators. The improvement service will be getting metadata, I think you said, Mrs. Mailer, from the local authorities, but how do we know that metadata has been collected the same way across all local authorities?
We don't.
I think
I think I'll take Gordon on the specific health and social care aspects, and Charlene, I think you want to come in and clarify and hopefully answer the questions. Gordon first, thank you.
Yeah, so my point, and this is a personal view. I don't have the detail here, but I would suggest that the data reporting, recording, and processing activity is key, but there has to be a very robust quality assurance process behind that, both in terms of how the councils are populating the data sets and how the improvement service is carrying out the analysis, the aggregating and the benchmarking. The bit that I need to reference is, though, that officers of councils are part of benchmarking groups and do meet with colleagues to discuss the approaches that are being taken to ensure, where possible, there is a high level of validity and reliability about this data. What I would say is that would previously, from the perspective of the Health and Social Care Partnership, be our colleague Diane Fraser, who, as colleagues will know, has moved on. And certainly during the period of the pandemic, that wouldn't have been an activity that was able to be prioritised. So we need to look at the extent to which we can reinstate that, so that when we're having conversations with benchmarking partners and other local authorities, we can be absolutely confident that we are able to make meaningful comparisons by all reporting the same things.
Thank you, Gordon. I think for the purpose of this report, which is for 2019-20, Diane Fraser was still with us, I believe, and so I would hope that the benchmarking groups and data validity groups would have been able to ensure that there was some consistency across the board on that. What happens for the year of COVID remains to be seen, I suppose. So the report for 2021 might prove to be more challenging in terms of consistency, perhaps across all local authorities. Thank you, Gordon. Charlene, do you also want to comment on this question from Councillor Stewart?
Thank you, Councillor McCall. I think Gordon has covered most of the points there. Suffice to say that it is not an exact science. Councils should be complying with the metadata. There is quite clear and succinct guidance to follow, but again, you know, we can't say for certain that we are, as local authorities, all following and inputting the same data into the report.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Colin. I hope that answers your questions for now, at least.
Could I just come in and
I'm coming to you, Claire. Yeah, Claire, yes.
I think just to add to what both Charlene and Gordon have stated there, as Charlene stated, we have the guidance, there's sort of definitions for each of the indicators, which is quite prescriptive about how we measure and report performance against each indicator. As Gordon's described, we then have internally within each local authority our own internal quality assurance and audit and check mechanisms. So we have got quality assurance frameworks almost that support any data that we submit to any body and organisation. And equally, many of the indicators will have external scrutiny. So, for example, within housing and within other areas, we have, say, the Scottish Housing Regulator, who undertake a full check. Often will do either audit checks or indeed visits to ensure scrutiny of data. So there's some wraparound other sort of external quality assurance checks on the data that's submitted. And indeed, these are just a small number of the overall performance indicators that we do submit to our own kind of regulatory bodies, such as the Housing Regulator, whereby we've maybe got, 100 or so plus indicators, which goes through a fairly detailed scrutiny process by the Housing Regulator. But yes, there are, as you can see, sort of, challenges in the benchmarking groups that many of our services sit within. We'll have those discussions at an officer and professional level to sort of ensure that we're kind of comparing apples with apples.
Thank you, Claire. Councillor Stewart, does that answer your questions?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the answers. It's just that if we've got two examples there of where data has not been recorded in the same manner, even though presumably there are, all the internal and external controls, then, there's always going to be a question over the validity of the other indicators, and we as elected members are asked to scrutinise this information, but may not be able to have 100% confidence that our position in relation to the other local authorities is being correctly reported if data collection anomalies or cleansing can change our position so drastically. I don't have an answer to it, but
well, thank you for the questions. I think they're important questions actually to ensure that we, as you say, as elected members, have confidence in the data that's put before us, particularly here at the Scrutiny Committee. And so perhaps it's something that we can take on board for the next report to provide perhaps some narrative around the confidence that we have, at least for our own data, that ensures that the data that's been presented for our local authority is robust and is validated, and that we can have confidence in it. So that's maybe something for officers to take away with them following this round of questioning. So thank you, Councillor Stewart, for your question, and to all the officers for your very comprehensive responses. Very much appreciated indeed. Okay, thank you, Colin. Councillor Jarvis, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. It's on page 23 and it's the CHN 22 and 23. It's just that the figures here, I wondered why CHN 22 we have suddenly shot well above the Scottish average, and in CHN 23, whereby we have certainly improved between 2019 and 20, we are still way above the Scottish average. This is for children protection and their placements and registration.
Who would like to take that question?
I'm happy to take that question, Councillor McCall. It's Hazel Robertson.
Thank you, Hazel.
Really, the figures relate to quite small numbers for the child protection re-registrations within 18 months. What we know with the local government benchmarking framework is that they look at the number of children who have been added to the child protection register within that period. So the percentage relates to those children who have been then re-registered within that period. And we know from this information that there were a total of 11 children who were re-registered within that period of time. Of that number, there were 2 family groups of 3 children. So from that total number of 11, you can see we're talking about relatively small numbers. It has changed the percentage quite significantly. But, you know, these are children, perhaps when we've been looking over this last period of time, we've not had sufficient supports within the community for the families to rely on that has given a sense of protection of these children so that they have been re-registered. I mean, it does raise questions about, was the deregistration considered fully at the time of their deregistration, and could that have been done differently? But, you know, I mean, I think it probably does give assurance that these are children who are still being supervised and there's the oversight of their circumstances being considered. I mean, the rank, I mean, we have closely monitored this within our Child Protection Committee. It's something that is regularly reviewed, the registration rates generally and the re-registration rates in particular. So I certainly can assure members that, you know, this is something that is closely monitored. In relation to, in relation to CHN 23, it's quite interesting having just listened to Councillor Stewart's comments, because I think this is a good example of where local authorities aren't measuring the same information, and we know that for sure. You know, certainly we have improved over the last year's figures quite significantly, but this measure is always complex because it includes placements that are positive. So, for example, it includes the numbers of children who move to a kinship arrangement and also back home safely. So these we would regard as very positive moves for a child. So it can appear that the more moves that a child has, the more negative the position is. But in Perth Kinross, we will count these moves differently from some of our colleagues across Scotland. So we start from 0. So from the very first placement, that will be 1. Many authorities will only count from the first placement. So they're counting from a foster placement potentially to a second placement or to a residential placement. So it does present some anomalies for us, and I'm not sure how confident we can be in just looking at these figures. But again, as an assurance, just really to say that, you know, we are trying to keep the number of placements that children experience very low. Certainly of our 375 children who were looked after during 1920, there were 74 who had more than 1 placement. That's 20% of that total. And 59 of those 74 had 2 placements. So there were 15 children who had more than 2 placements. We know who these children are, and 5 of them went home and 5 of them were in kinship placements. 3 unfortunately ended up in a residential school and 2 in foster care. But so we're acutely aware of the numbers of these children.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Hazel. And does that answer your question, or do you have a supplementary?
No, I'd just like to make a comment, if I may, because I mean, small numbers always skew figures. But I would just hope that we're never in a position where, you know, children in placements are put back home or put back somewhere else, you know, too speedily without a lot of due care and attention. That's my only, you know, query from what you said, but thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Hazel, for your reply. Councillor Ahern, you want to come back in on the question you asked earlier?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Sharon, for that quick response in terms of the numbers. I've worked it out that that's the 4% drop is roughly 43. And so that really puts 166 children not meeting the development milestones. Could I ask whether that correlates to right across Perth and Kinross area, or does that correlate to areas where there is low deprivation or high deprivation, sorry, which I think you possibly touched on in your answer to when you previously answered my question.
Thank you, Chris. Sharon?
Yes, thank you, Councillor McCall, and thank you, Councillor Ahern. Yes, I think I did allude to it. I suppose it should be noted that this is actually national health data, because this is 27 to 30 months developmental checks, and of course not all children do attend nursery at that age, and that's why it's so important to us, because we recognise that the earlier we can intervene where difficulties are identified, then the better chance there is of support. But what it does do is it gives us almost a baseline measure with which to understand the challenges that some children come to nursery with. And to answer your question specifically, it's very, very clear that the areas of deprivation are where the most need is, and it's quite stark actually, and that is a measure that takes her all the way through education attainment. So it starts at a very young age, and then it can continue if we don't intervene early enough or get the right supports in place. And we're very focused on that this year, and our improvement plan as a local authority is very much focused on inclusive practice, early intervention, and putting in targeted supports where they're needed. And we've got a very large range of measures in our raising attainment strategy to make that happen. But the most important stage to intervene is at this stage, so that's why we've put in significant investment into those areas for this year.
Okay, thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Chris.
You're quite right. It is a stark contrast, and it's very good to see that you're taking it very seriously, and the officers are working really well to help combat that issue. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chris and Sharon. Councillor Stewart, you have an additional question. We've spent quite a lot of time in this report, and I'll take your question now. And if there is any other questions or comments, can I ask members to please put it in the chat box now? Councillor Stewart.
This one is on the last page of the report, and it's indicator Econ 6, investment in economic development and tourism per thousand of population. The PKC figure has declined from 19 to 20 in terms of amount of spend, but our rank has improved by 3 places. So it was really just to understand whether the local authority in first place is spending less than £53,000 or more than £102,000. I want to understand what is measured as good in this respect. Is it a low spend per thousand of population or a high spend per thousand of population?
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Who wishes to answer this question from the officers, please?
Can I ask if Alison Seggy is here to respond to this question, please?
I am, Claire. Happy to respond. Thanks for the question, Councillor Stewart. I think my interpretation of this is that a high spend is a good spend in terms of, particularly from an economic development perspective, in terms of spend on economic development activity. So the Scottish average, I think, is 102,000, and we are quite significantly below that, and always have been, actually, in terms of our number of staff and actual investment in economic development, although there have been some welcome additional spend over the years in terms of one-off add-ons to our budget. But over the piece, we do tend to spend, relatively speaking, less than other local authorities on average.
So our improvement in rank is because a lot of other local authorities must have
even less
fallen back further.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's my understanding.
Thank you both. So that's the end of the questions. So thank you everyone for your questions. I have Councillor Parrott wishes to make a comment.
Yes, thank you very much, convener. I've listened with great interest to all the questioning there's been on this report, and it's very interesting. But I come back to my conclusion as ever on this report that the statistics presented should always be looked at as indicative rather than conclusive, and as the starting point for further inquiry. And all the lines of questioning have showed that when you start digging into the detail of these, small pictures we get on each frame, that there's a lot more to be seen. and the style of presentation is very difficult to decide, because, you know, when you start digging in and asking questions, you could say that another style is more appropriate, but it's hugely difficult. I'd just like to pick up on one point, and that relates to the Climate 2 figures. And like Councillor Sarwar, I was worried on first sight to see that we are well over the Scottish average. But then it occurred to me that transport is a major contributor of CO2 emissions. We have a low density of population in a large area, and compared with many local authorities, we have a massive transit transports issue. And I suspect that we could reduce our emissions per resident very considerably, but then there's still a lot of emissions being generated by people who are simply passing through. I'd love to see, for example, what the figures for Dundee on this are, a high population in a very small area. So I'd simply conclude by saying these are all very interesting, but at the end of the day, they are the starting point for further inquiry. And going back to the point that Councillor Illingworth made as to the utility, I think it's through that further inquiry we find the leads that we need to follow up on in terms of improving the authority's overall performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parrott, and I do agree with the comments that you've made, and I think what makes it more challenging this year is the fact this report is for a period of time that ended 15 months ago. So I suspect, particularly in the climate measures, because so many cars were actually off the road over the past 12 months, there will be a difference perhaps on that. But you're right, it is an opportunity to see where the figures lead us and to delve further and see what forward action should be taken. But given that this report was so late being produced and supplied to members, I want to thank everybody for their questions and for taking the time to clearly read the report in some detail. I think that's been very much appreciated. And so we'll close this section now and we'll move on to the next paper, which is the annual governance statement. And I think Donald Henderson is going to present that.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Convener. This is my professional assessment of the Council's compliance with data protection for the last year. Obviously, the major impact on data protection over the year was clearly coronavirus. That affected both what the Council was doing and the way it had to do it. It also impacted on the work of my team. And like everyone else, we were working in different circumstances, using reasonably unfamiliar technology to begin with, and being asked to do new things. All in all, I consider that the Council has done well in terms of compliance over the last year. I know that the number of breaches has increased, but the overall number is still a very small fraction of the number of times personal data was processed in the year. And that includes completely new uses of data, particularly for community support. I think the increase is probably due largely to people using new technology and having to work in unfamiliar circumstances and often under a degree of pressure that they weren't used to. I think it's easy to focus on data breaches because it's a nice, easy figure and it sticks out. I think of more concern to me is the continuing inability for the Council to address some of the more basic issues of compliance, as I've highlighted in the report in section 3.5. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Donald. I note, if I may, I'm going to ask a question to start with. I noticed that one of the data breaches is in Education and Children's Services, one of the larger ones, and I'm just wondering if that's specifically in relation to the introduction of new teaching technology, or if you can give us any wider clarity around that.
No, it was much simpler than that. Most of the breach, in fact, the significant breaches had absolutely nothing to do with coronavirus. They were basic mistakes, sending things to the wrong people, sometimes physically sending things to the wrong people. Yeah.
Okay, is that by email, by electronic communication?
Mostly it was actually physical.
Okay. And what remedies are put in place to try and reduce that going forward?
It's very difficult to put technical remedies in place. Mostly it's plain ordinary human error. People do the wrong thing.
Okay.
People do things like choose the wrong, if I may use the example, the wrong Sheila McCall because we've got two.
I'm not sure about that, but
yeah, you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean.
People with the same name or very similar names, they choose the wrong one. It's difficult not to do that. We even had something delivered physically to the wrong address.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions on this report. So, Councillor Hearn, you're first up.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Henderson, for the report. My question is on paragraph 3.2.12, which is regarding your statement there that you've got the DPO is confident that all significant data breaches of this type were reported during the year, and we're talking about email breaches. Surely, if a person wasn't aware that they carried out a breach in an email, they wouldn't know to report it. So my assumption is that your statement there is based on the fact that the sender from within PKC has reported the breach to yourself and not the recipient. And if that's the case, is it then possible that there's quite a few other people that may well have sent emails and not realise they've had a breach?
It's possible. Most breaches are actually notified to the sender by the recipient.
Right. So
if the recipient chooses not to highlight it, then yes.
So you're confident that all these data breaches that were reported by either the sender or recipient have been picked up. And I just wonder how you base your confidence if the fact that there were quite a number of people then that sent an email and were only informed by the sender, that there's still a number of other people that may well have breached it but not been informed. And it's just your statement that you're confident.
I am confident because the reaction of people is normally that they are horrified that they've done something, and I think that is reflected well across the council. And when people do something, they do want to report it and find out what they should be doing about it. I don't think people are inclined to cover these up.
I wasn't suggesting they were covering it up, but if they weren't informed by a recipient that there had been a breach, they wouldn't have known about it.
Donald's not doing well at the moment, but no. But
why I've been muted, but that comment wasn't from me. Donald, I don't know who that was. I think what Councillor Hearn is trying to understand, and I think it's a very valid question, and I'm not sure if I understand the answer myself, is that if there are data breaches, does everyone know who has either been the subject of a data breach or the instigator of one, that they need to report it so that you can capture it in these statistics? Is that what you're trying to get to, Chris?
I think that's part of the answer, but if you don't know you've had a breach or done a breach in an email, and you probably won't, as Donald said, you won't know you've had breached the Data Protection Act unless you're informed by your recipient. And it was just the fact that he was confident in his assessment that most of these had been picked up.
Okay. Donald, I think, are you able to answer that comment or question from Councillor Hearn?
I think there's 2 points there. If somebody doesn't know they've done a data breach, they're never going to report it. That's obvious. I think, on the other hand, where people do know they've done a data breach or think they've done a data breach, they do report it. We get reports of things that aren't data breaches because people are concerned about them. Which is why I think I can be confident that where people have identified there's a breach, they are contacting me. I am aware that not everybody understands what a breach is, but we continue to work on that one.
Yeah, I think that was my point, I think. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Donald. It does raise an important point, though, to make sure that people do understand what a breach is, and that they should report it. So maybe it's something worthwhile, maybe worth considering, you know, doing a refresher for both staff, elected members, and others who engage with the council. Thank you both. So the next question is from Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. My question's about the graph in section 3.2.5, which tells us about the nature of breaches. Within that graph, if I'm reading the axis correctly, I think it implies that around about half, if not a little bit more, of breaches are actually under the category of email error. It's a two-part question. By email error, do we mean the sort of old classic that may have caught some of us out in our lives as well, of accidentally CCing people when we should have been BCCing them? Is that what this bar relates to? And if that is the root cause of the majority of those, are there software protections we could put in place that flag, for example, if someone has more than maybe 3 or 4 or whatever the number of people is in carbon copy in CC, it will put a little warning to say, did you intend to disclose these people's emails addressed to each other, or did you intend to use BCC? Thank you.
Thank you.
Donald?
Yes, the majority of these will be CC rather than BCC. It will also be choosing the wrong email address when in autocomplete. So there are 2 other Donalds in the council, and I occasionally get emails from colleagues to the wrong Donald. So that happens as well. There are technical solutions. They tend to cost either in terms of finance or in terms of increased work, and I have never felt it appropriate to recommend that these are implemented. A lot of people send multiple things correctly by CC, and if they had to do an extra step every time they did that, it would be awkward. Equally, you can turn off autocomplete, but that in itself puts extra work in. So it's a balance. Is 80 email errors in a year worth making things awkward for 2,000 or 3,000 people? I'm not sure.
Okay,
Those
thank
are
you.
judgments that I'll leave to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you, Alistair. I'm with you on that one. I'll leave those judgments to someone else. I wouldn't like to make them myself. Councillor Stewart, Councillor Colin Stewart, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. My question is on 4.1 of the report. Issues with a small number of live and planned projects where processing of personal data would be considered unlawful without changes being made, but the council is dependent on suppliers acceding to our wishes, and they're proving reluctant to make the necessary changes. I'm just wondering about how we manage to engage software suppliers who presumably, you know, are large multinational corporations used to dealing with the data protection requirements in the different jurisdictions, and they produce software which doesn't do what we want it to do, but also how we manage to, you know, are we managing to, are we being too, you know, putting too strict an interpretation on the data protection that the suppliers don't agree with, or are we managing somehow during our procurement process to engage suppliers who are not familiar with the UK's data protection laws?
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Donald, are you able to answer that question?
Councillor, yes.
Some of it's technical around procurement.
Some of it is process within the council. Some of it is legacy and predates GDPR. Some of it is differences of opinion between what the supplier thinks is correct and what we think is correct. And I don't know how we address that one properly.
Okay. Can I ask how many incidents there are? Sorry, Councillor Stewart, I thought you'd finished asking. Do you have a supplementary?
Well, no, your supplementary is just as good as mine was going to be. So.
Thank you. I'm just curious to know how many suppliers or how many contracts fall into this.
2 or 3.
2 or 3. Okay. Thank you. I suppose it depends on how widely they're used across the council, though.
Yeah.
So, Councillor Stewart, do you have another question or comment?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ian Massey, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, convener, and thank you, Mr. Henderson, for your report. My questions are on point 44, which can be found on page 30 of our pack. It may come as a surprise to many Perth and Kinross constituents that their personal data has been transferred to companies in the USA. I certainly never knew this was happening. In July 2020, the EU-US Privacy Shield Agreement, under which the transfer of this data was conducted, was found by the European Court to be incompatible with the EU laws, our GDPR. If I may, convener, I have 2 questions for Mr. Henderson.
You may.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson, what personal information have Perth and Kinross Council transferred to the USA? And my second question is, can you give any details of the one significant instance steps were taken during last year, to relocate information from the USA to the EU, which you mention in your report?
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Donald?
What data do we have in the USA? On the whole, we have very little data in the USA. It tends to be user IDs, maybe some email addresses for users, that sort of thing. We don't, as far as I am aware, have any significant volume of data in the USA. The information that was transferred to the EU related to an application that some schools use for parental contact, and when we recognised that there was an issue following the striking down of Privacy Shield, we realised that there was an alternative way that we could work with the supplier, a subscription version rather than a free version, but that relocated the majority of the data into the EU instead, and that was done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Councillor Massey?
It does, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think the last question I have, oh sorry, Lisa, I noticed that you wanted to make a comment. I'm apologies, my chat function isn't working properly today. So Lisa, I think your comment was perhaps on the earlier question from Councillor Stewart.
I think it's all actually linked. It's really just about giving some more assurance around the procurement process. As Donald indicated, some of the difficulties that we're dealing with are legacy issues, and therefore the only opportunity to address those is as contracts come up for renegotiation. In terms of our new contracts, all of our standard contracts terms and conditions have been amended to take account of the GDPR requirements to ensure that they are compliant, and where we've had an opportunity to engage in variations to address these issues, that is being done. But as I say, some of the things are legacy issues, and the other point is that in some cases our suppliers have not got to the stage where they've reviewed their terms and conditions, and on these situations we're working with them as a case-by-case basis, and we make a risk-based decision as to what we can manage and what mitigating factors we can put in place. And sometimes it is a difference of opinion which we have to then seek to try and address, but these are being managed and are being viewed and are being taken seriously and managed as an active ongoing concern. But it's to give assurance that in terms of the procurement aspect, these are being addressed through our standard contract terms and conditions. So I hope that provides some assurance to councillors on that point.
Thank you, Lisa, and yes, it is reassuring to hear that, although I do expect nothing less. Thank you. And the last question I have is from Councillor Liz Barrett, and then after I will take any comments that people have. So Liz.
Thank you, Convener. First, many thanks to the Data Protection Officer and his team for this report, and thank you for all your work in the face of what you've highlighted as our lack of resources over the period. I have two brief questions, if I may. On 3.2.8, which areas aren't keen to engage with you and amend their practices, and what's being done about this if they're within PKC?
I think I think you're maybe taking that out of context. I don't think there are particular areas that aren't engaging. I am aware of one or two areas who will be less keen with the advice I'm giving them, but will work with me. So it's not like there's a clump of the council that isn't engaging with me. It's just keenness at the time, shall we say.
Thank you, that's reassuring. And the other question is at 3.77 to 378, you've highlighted the risk to the council associated with the lack of resources for your team. And I wonder how serious is your concern about that and what needs to be done to tackle it?
I have raised that concern for 3 years now, and that is an issue for the council rather than for me.
Thank you, Donald. I'm not sure if that answers your question entirely, Liz.
It doesn't really, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, so
thank you, Lisa.
Lisa Simpson, I think, wants to come in and make a comment here.
I think there has been a general issue around resources, and I'm sure it's not just within this council but within a number of councils across the piece where we're all working within a financial envelope that doesn't get zeros added to it on an annual basis, I have to say. The DP function, however, is taken very, very seriously, and the resource issue, particularly that's exacerbated by the retirement of Mr Henderson. This will be your last DPO report from Mr Henderson. With the retirement, that is something that is being dealt with at the highest level. It is being discussed at EOT, and arrangements are being put in place, and the resource situation is being looked at. We're satisfied that we can have a temporary solution at the moment, which will ensure that the function is adequately covered and that the statutory risk is being managed. I'm satisfied that we can put in place interim arrangements in my capacity as a Senior Information Risk Officer for the Council, but it is something that is being identified as potential budget pressures going forward, and it will be continually monitored by the EOT in terms of our corporate risks around this area.
Okay, Liz, do you have any further comment or question for Lisa?
I think that does clarify it. I mean, I am aware about the 24% cut to corporate support services over the last 10 years. So I mean, I understand your financial envelope problems, but I'm glad to hear that this is a high priority. Thanks, Lisa. I'm just sorry it's taking Donald's retirement to actually get it sorted a bit.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Lisa. And I too am welcome the fact that this is a priority, and I envy Donald his retirement, and I hope you have a long and happy one.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions or comments on this report, then I will thank everyone for their attendance today, and I hereby call this meeting to a close. Thank you, everyone.